The stench of lightning and charred flesh fills the air. You awaken on a mortuary slab in agony. You don't know it, but you've just been hit with the force of a lightning bolt. Your body has been stitched together, the internal organs wedged into the rib cage, the limbs pieced together from the bodies of dead human beings. The pain is beyond all description, and you stagger awake and up with one question in your mind, a question that will throw you into the world on a journey in which you will commit crimes, commit murder, destroy even the few things that you might claim to love, on a quest for your creator. You are not a human. You are not a child of God. You are a monster. You are Frankenstein's monster.
It's alive. It's alive. Oh, it's alive. It's alive. It's alive. It's alive.
The year is 1816, summertime. Everyone, understandably, wants to go on vacation. 4 young, relatively wealthy, artistic, creative types book a villa together on the banks of Lake Geneva in Switzerland. This is the semi-legendary Villa di Adati. And the 4 young people in question would become some of the most famous literary and artistic figures in English and some might say world history. Lord Byron, the famous epic poet and political revolutionary, Percy Bysshe Shelley, the romantic poet, and John Polidori, who was rather less famous than the others, but we believe was the creator of the modern vampire. The 4th of these young creative figures was the wife of Percy Bysshe Shelley, commonly known as Mary Shelley, therefore. Her actual name came from her mother, who was also a famed novelist and an intellectual in London of the day, Mary Wollstonecraft. And so the full name of the young lady we're talking about is Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley, who in true contemporary style we will refer to by her 3 initials, MWS. MWS is only 19, the men are in their early 20s. These are 4 kids out to party, at least in the style of the early 1800s. They don't have any television, they don't have any films or movies, so to entertain each other in the evening, they tell stories, and they tell stories of Gothic horror. Indeed, you'd have to say that these 4 are Goths. Not because they were conforming to any style known as Goth at the time, but because they were the prototypical Goths that the young teenagers in the 1980s who you might have seen strolling through your town centre in strange romantic revival clothes were basing themselves on these 4 young bohemians. And most Goth of them all, I believe, must have been Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley, MWS, a young, intense intellectual who had gone into the public life of London and got to know many, if not all, of the great artists and intellectuals of the day, which is how she come into contact with Percy Bysshe Shelley, and they had married at very young ages by our contemporary standards. And in her conversations with those great intellectuals of the day, MWS began to develop ideas about, in particular, philosophy. And she would express many of these ideas in the Gothic tale of horror that she told for her friends in the holiday of 1816. And it was a story that we now know as Frankenstein, the Modern Prometheus. To correct that common but well-known error, Frankenstein is not the monster. Frankenstein is the creator of the monster. Frankenstein is an arrogant, there can be no other word for him, an arrogant but very powerful scientific thinker. And he wants to do what only Prometheus of myth has done before, which is to steal fire for the gods, by which we mean to take the power of the gods for ourselves, which for Frankenstein is the power of creation and the power of life and death. And he's seeking to make life. And he does indeed succeed in the creation of his monster.
Will you play with me? Would you like one of my flowers? You have those, and I'll have these. See how mine float? No, you're hurting me! No!
If it was true of Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley, as it's true of many young teenage goths that we may know today, that she was perhaps depressed or suffering some kind of existential angst about the universe around her, she may have had good reason. MWS was living at a very particular time in human history when our ideas about the universe, our world and ourselves and our place in the world and in the universe was being severely challenged. For thousands of years, we had, as a culture, believed that we were creations of God, divine beings, sparks of an ultimate creative force in the universe. And whatever suffering we went through, that knowledge that we were children of this divine creator and that we were fulfilling their purpose in the world gave us a sense of meaning. But this meaning, this story, was being stripped away by an even more powerful force. For centuries, people had looked out into the galaxies and universe beyond the Earth and found different meanings using first telescopes like Galileo Galilei, and they had seen and suspected that in fact we were not the center of the universe. We were one of many planets orbiting the sun. They had used microscopes to look down and found the microscopic life, and that humans were indeed constructed of cells. And our whole view of the world was being changed by one tremendously powerful new force in the world, the force of science. Think about what was happening in 1816. This was, if not the year, around the year of the discovery of electromagnetism, the force that will give Frankenstein life. It's only a few decades before the discovery of the nerve cell, probably about a century and a half before the first organ transplant, where the long-held belief was proven that you could take an organ from one human being and place it into another to extend their lifespan. Yet all of this scientific discovery was prefigured in the year 1816 by the young MWS. Not a bad achievement for a teenage goth. Humans, no longer the children of God, now understood ourselves in a new way. We were now man as a machine. The early 1800s was the emergence of the Industrial Revolution, the change that machines were making in the world. And so it became a natural idea for thinkers of the day to start to consider that human beings were machines. And by thinking of the human body in this way, we were able to start considering that as we fixed a machine, as we were able to take random spare parts and fix up the steam engines of the day, we too would be able to do this with the human body. And this was the idea that Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley turned into story. And from here we had the seed of Frankenstein, the modern Prometheus. What if a young ambitious scientist was able to take the parts, the spare parts from dead bodies, from the broken machine bodies of men, and stitch them together to make a new life? What would the consequences of this be?
All those moments will be lost in time, like tears in rain.
Look, think about what Mary Shelley did. She was 19 years old and she told a story. She wrote a novel. And 200 years later, almost everyone in the world can still tell you about Frankenstein. This is a story that has survived for 2 centuries. Think about all the stories that are told that nobody will ever remember, all the novels that are ever written that nobody will ever even read. And Mary Shelley created a story that survived for 200 years. Why? Why is it that Frankenstein has stayed with us for this long? Why is it that we have told and retold this story over and over again? It's because Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley created a myth, a modern myth for the age of science. This word, myth, it comes from the ancient Greek, when they had 2 ways of thinking about the mind: the logos, the logical mind that gives us technology and science, that brings order into the world, the mind that has given us the age of science that we live in today. But they also had the mythos, and the mythos was the dreaming mind that today we think of as the unconscious mind. And the mythos was the mind of the poet, the mind of the artist, and the mind of the storyteller, and the stories that spoke to the mythos within us. These were sacred stories. These were stories of heroes, stories of gods. And for all of human history, we have had myths through to the modern day, and new myths that we tell for the age of science, beginning with Mary Shelley and Frankenstein and modern Prometheus. Myths that we now call science fiction. Science has revolutionized our view of the universe. We have been in a race to do what humans have always done, to find new stories, to give the new reality of the universe meaning. If Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley was the first writer to ask if man is a machine, and if she was among the first intellectuals, artists, creators, writers, and storytellers to address the new realities that science was showing humans about the universe that we inhabited, she would not be the last. The idea of man as machine and the Frankenstein's monster that Mary Shelley created in her work of literature has echoed through the 2 centuries of modern storytelling that have followed on Frankenstein, the modern Prometheus. Who is Roy Batty, the replicant at the heart of the movie Blade Runner, based on the novel Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep by the novelist Philip K. Dick? Who is Roy Batty, if not a version of Frankenstein's monster? He has been created by human beings to do the work of a machine. Replicants in the world of Blade Runner are used as slaves and as machines. Roy Batty is created as the ultimate super soldier, and he escapes that fate to return to Earth and to confront his creator, the founder of Tyrell Corporation. What are the androids of the television series Westworld but a multiple cast of Frankenstein's monsters, exploring the metaphysical questions of what it is to think of man as a machine? Can we be reset? Can our personalities be overwritten? Again, we see this question of man as machine asked in the Wachowski brothers movie The Matrix, where Keanu Reeves as Neo has the now iconic to our contemporary culture moment of swallowing the red pill, waking up from an illusionary human world to find he is trapped in a world of machines as he wakes like an embryo birthing into a new world from the machine cocoon. Man as machine. This is the storytelling tradition of science fiction. Science fiction is our modern mythology. For 200 years, as science has revolutionized our view of the universe, great storytellers, beginning with Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley, Frankenstein, and Modern Prometheus, have worked to create new myths for the modern era and told great stories of science fiction. If we are faced with an infinite universe, with a near infinite number of stars, a near infinite number of planets, how will humans go boldly into that space? Will we encounter alien civilizations, alien empires? Will we fight wars as we once fought naval battles on the planet Earth? Or will the reality of an infinite universe be far stranger still? If human beings are creations of genetics and DNA, is it possible we might manipulate that DNA or experience mutations in it that will create superhuman beings who might behave heroically or perhaps villainously? And will we in some ways become like the gods of ancient history, many of whom are characters in the stories that we tell of superhuman adventures? As we have developed the technology of computation and we have brought computers into the world, and those computers have gained in power and have begun to create within them entire new worlds and realities, often obeying their own laws of physics and philosophies? Is it possible that our own world and our own universe is in some sense a computer simulation, and are we only characters within some cosmic game? As we have considered the possibilities of alien life on other planets, we've seen reflected the plasticity of our own existence and the hypocrisy of our attitudes to those who are different from the norm within our society. And we have explored the power dynamics and the politics of the real world through the fantasies and metaphors of science fiction and fantasy. Even as, in the 20th century, science fiction and fantasy have come to fill the cinema and television screen, to populate the virtual worlds of computer games and role-playing games, and to create some of the most profoundly philosophically interesting works of literature throughout the last century. Even as science fiction has done all of this and more, the future for science fiction may perhaps eclipse its past. Because sci-fi and fantasy were not simply entertaining. Of course they're entertaining. Anything that we love is entertaining in that way. We want to be entertained by the stories that we watch. But we're also in the fields of sci-fi and fantasy doing something rather wonderfully and strangely important. We are creating the modern myths for the world that science is showing us. Hence, science fiction, fantasy, drawing on the ancient myths from the past and bringing them back into the modern world in the process of mythopoeia, as the wonderful J.R.R. Tolkien called it. This is the real importance of sci-fi and fantasy, and this is the topic of this course in advanced science fiction and fantasy writing the 21st century myth. We're going to be searching through the great 2-century history of science fiction, diving back into the ancient myths of the past and how they have been brought into the present in fantasy. And we're going to be seeking the new myths for the 21st century. Some time ago, I asked my followers on Twitter which are the great sci-fi and fantasy franchises, thinking of things like Marvel, superhero, Avengers, Star Wars, Star Trek, Lord of the Rings, Game of Thrones, you name it. Which of these great franchises was the great mythology of the 21st century? And none other than Neil fucking Gaiman replied to me to say that those all seemed like rather 20th century myths. And maybe the 21st century myth was still to come. There is something very 20th century. Literally, they're all born in the 20th century and have run into the 21st. But there's also in the values and the ethos conveyed in these 20th century myths, something particularly last century. The 21st century myths are still to be written. Maybe they're being written at the moment. Maybe they've just been published. Maybe some of the great writers of science fiction and fantasy who are just coming to the fore have already composed them, but I suspect they are yet to be written. Who will write them? Who will write the great mythic stories of the 21st century? Will it be Neil Gaiman? Could be. It's a strong possibility. One of the great storytellers of all time. Will it be me? Could I have that honour? It's possible. I am in the game. Could it be you? Could you be the writer of the great myth of the 21st century? Could your stories live on? Myths that we profoundly need to give meaning to this, the 21st century that we are all living in. Perhaps if you follow the course in advanced sci-fi and fantasy, writing the 21st century myth, it might help you fulfill that goal, even if that isn't your ambition, even if you're simply a huge fan of sci-fi and fantasy. I invite you to come along on this journey.